The yellow envelope was taped to my front door, flapping in the cold wind. I opened it with trembling hands and saw the words, "Every man my age fears foreclosure, $215,000, my home, my pride." My entire life's work was about to be auctioned off to the highest bidder at the county courthouse. I did not call a bank, and I did not run away. Instead, I took that debt notice to a man who understood a different kind of law. I watched as he took a heavy iron nail and drove it right through the center of that legal document, pinning it to a rough wooden beam in his workshop. The shouting of the debt collectors stopped. The fear that had been strangling my heart for months simply vanished. The paper that was meant to destroy me was now nothing more than a scrap of trash, held by a single nail. Before I tell you who that man was, and how he saved my family from the abyss, I would love to know which beautiful American city you are watching from today. Please, leave a comment below. The sun sets a little differently when you reach 70. It is not just the end of a day anymore. It feels like the quiet closing of a very long book. I sat on my porch in the soft light of a Pennsylvania evening, watching the shadows of the oak trees stretch across the yard. This house, this piece of land, it was supposed to be our fortress, our sanctuary. 40 years. That is how long Linda and I have been here. 40 years of waking up before the sun to the smell of strong coffee and the sound of the radio. 40 years of fixing leaky faucets, painting the shutters every 5 summers, and measuring our daughter's height with a pencil on the kitchen doorframe. To us, this was not just real estate. This was the American dream, built with sweat, patience, and a lot of prayer. We thought we had done everything right. We worked hard. We saved. We paid our tithes at the little white church down the road. We were the generation that believed if you put in an honest day's work, the world would be honest with you. We built our lives on what we thought was solid rock. But, as I would soon find out, even the strongest foundation can turn to sinking sand when the storms of life hit from a direction you never expected. The storm did not come in the form of clouds or rain. It came in a thin, white envelope. It started with our son-in-law, William. Now, William is a good man. He is a hard worker, and he loves our daughter, Susan, with everything he has. But William had a dream of his own. He wanted to build something big, a business of his own, a legacy. He came to us 2 years ago, full of excitement, talking about a new construction venture. He just needed a little backing, a little collateral to get the loan from the bank. And because we loved him, and because we believed in family, we signed the papers. We put our home up as a guarantee. At the time, it felt like the right thing to do. We wanted to be the wind beneath their wings. We never imagined the wind would turn into a hurricane, a series of bad decisions, a market that turned cold, and a partner who disappeared with the remaining cash. Suddenly, the dream was gone, and in its place was a mountain of debt that I could not even begin to fathom. $215,000. I remember saying that number out loud in the quiet of our living room. $215,000. The words felt heavy in my mouth, like stones. It was a number so large it did not even feel real. It was more than we had in our retirement accounts. It was more than the house was worth in this economy. It was a debt that we could never, ever pay back in the years we had left. The atmosphere in our home changed overnight. The laughter that used to fill the kitchen was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence. I began to notice things that broke my heart. I would wake up at 2 a.m. and find the bed empty beside me. I would walk down the hallway and find Linda sitting at the small kitchen table, the only light coming from the open refrigerator. She would be staring at the floor, her hands wrapped around a cold mug of tea. She didn't want me to see her cry, but I could see the tracks of tears on her cheeks. She was terrified. We were at an age where we should have been looking forward to rocking chairs and grandbabies. Instead, We were looking at the very real possibility of a moving truck and a homeless shelter. The shame was the worst part. Every time we went to the grocery store or sat in our usual pew at church, I felt like there was a giant red letter on my chest. I felt like a failure. I was the man of the house. I was supposed to protect her. I was supposed to keep her safe. And yet, because of one signature, I had put everything we owned on the line. One afternoon, I went out to the old barn behind the house. I just needed to be alone. I sat down on a hay bale and looked at my hands. They were old hands. The skin was thin, like parchment paper, and spotted with age, but they were calloused. They were the hands of a man who had spent 40 years laying bricks, hauling timber, and tilling the soil. I looked at those calluses, and for the first time in my life, I felt a deep, piercing sense of helplessness. In the past, if we had a problem, I could work my way out of it. If the roof leaked, I fixed it. If we needed extra money, I took on a second shift. My hands had always been my tools. They had always been enough. But as I looked at them there, in the dim light of the barn, I realized the truth. I could work 24 hours a day for the rest of my life, and I could never make $215,000. My strength was gone. My time was running out. These hands, which had built our world, were no longer strong enough to save it. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a great canyon, and the ground was crumbling beneath my feet. We were separated from our peace, separated from our security, by a gap that no amount of human effort could bridge. That is the moment when the reality of the situation truly hit me. We were not just in a financial hole. We were in a spiritual crisis. I had spent my life thinking I was the master of my own fate. I thought I was the one holding everything together, but the sand was shifting. The house was tilting, and there was nothing, absolutely nothing, I could do to stop it. I leaned my head back against the rough wood of the barn wall and closed my eyes. I didn't know it then, but this was the beginning of the most important lesson of my life. I had to reach the end of myself. I had to see the total failure of my own strength before I could understand the power of what was coming. The law of the bank was clear. We owed the money. The law of the world was cold. If you can't pay, you lose. We were living under the shadow of a broken promise and a debt that was growing every single day. I stayed in that barn until the sun went down completely. I didn't pray. Not yet. I was too empty for words. I just sat there, in the dark, listening to the sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the boards. It sounded like a mournful song, a song about lost dreams, and a debt that could never be satisfied. Little did I know that somewhere, in a plan much bigger than my own, a bridge was already being built. A way was being made. But before the light could come, I had to sit in the darkness and realize that I was completely, utterly lost. The morning of the meeting was cold. Not the kind of cold that makes you reach for a heavier coat, but a deep, bone-chilling dampness that settles in your soul. I stood by the window of our small dining room, watching a black sedan pull into our gravel driveway. I knew who it was. It was Mr. Miller, our family lawyer. He was a man of facts, a man of hard lines and cold ink. He was the messenger of a reality I was desperately trying to ignore. I watched him step out of the car. He adjusted his suit jacket and straightened his tie. He carried a leather briefcase that looked heavy, like it was filled with lead instead of paper. To him, this was just another Tuesday, just another case file. But to me, to Linda, he was the man who was coming to tell us that the roof over our heads no longer belonged to us. Linda was in the kitchen, her hands trembling as she set out 3 coffee mugs. She didn't say a word. There was no need for words anymore. The silence in our house had become a character of its own, heavy and suffocating. I went to the door and opened it before he could even knock. "Good morning." "Robert," Mr. Miller said. His voice was professional, or practiced. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at his watch. "Come in." "Jim," I replied. My own voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. Someone older. Someone weaker. We sat down at the wooden table. The same table where we had celebrated every Thanksgiving and Christmas for 4 decades. Miller opened his briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. The paper was crisp, white, and terrifying. He laid them out, one by one, like a surgeon laying out his tools before a difficult operation. "Robert, Linda," he began, clearing his throat. "I have reviewed the final notices from the bank. I have also looked at the cross-collateralization agreements from William's business loans. I will be direct with you, because I know you value the truth." He paused, and the ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder. Tick, 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 tick. The total amount due, including the principal, the accrued interest, and the legal penalties, is $215,000. $215,000. I sat there, staring at that number, written in bold, black ink on the page. $215,000. I repeated it in my mind. $215,000. It was a mountain. It was an abyss. It was a distance so vast that I could not see the other side. "Jim," I said, my voice cracking. "We have our savings. We have our 401k. We have been putting money away for a rainy day for 40 years. Miller shook his head slowly. He didn't look mean. He just looked tired. "Robert, I have calculated your total assets, your savings, your retirement accounts. All of it, even if we liquidated everything today, you would still be short by over $150,000. And that doesn't even account for where you would live." I looked over at Linda. She was staring at her coffee, a single tear, tracing a path through the flour dust on her cheek. She had been baking, out of habit, even though none of us could eat. The sight of her broke something inside of me. This was the abyss. In the ancient world, they talked about a chasm, a gap between a holy God and a broken humanity. I used to hear the preacher talk about it every Sunday. I thought I understood it. I thought it was just a metaphor. But sitting at that table, I realized that the abyss was real. It was made of numbers. It was made of debt. It was a hole so deep that no amount of human effort could ever fill it. I felt a strange, cold distance from God in that moment. For my whole life, I had been a good man. I followed the rules. I worked hard. I took care of my family. I believed that if I did my part, God would do his. It was a transaction, a deal. But now, the deal was broken. I felt like I was standing on one side of a canyon, and God was on the other side, and there was no bridge. No matter how much I prayed, no matter how many hymns I sang, the $215,000 was still there. It didn't move. It didn't shrink. It was a cold, hard fact that laughed at my faith. I started to feel a deep sense of guilt, not just for signing the papers, but for the pride I had carried for 70 years. I had thought I was the one providing for Linda. I had thought I was the one who kept the family safe. I had built my identity on my own strength. And now, my strength was shown to be nothing. I was a man who had worked for 40 years and ended up with a negative balance of $215,000. Miller continued to talk. Something about proceedings and timelines and foreclosure notices. But his voice started to fade into the background. All I could see were the numbers. They were like bars on a cage. I thought about the rituals we had followed. We never missed a Sunday. We always sat in the third pew. I had served as a deacon. I had helped build the new fellowship hall. But in that dining room, with that lawyer, all those things felt like toys. They felt like trying to put out a forest fire with a thimble of water. Religious rituals cannot pay a debt of $215,000. Good works cannot stop a bank from taking your home. Is there any other way? Linda asked. Her voice was a whisper. Miller looked at her with pity. Unless you have a relative with $250,000 sitting in a drawer. No. The law is the law. Linda, the debt is legal. The signatures are valid. The bank has the right to collect. The law. That was the word that kept ringing in my ears. The law is the law. It is fair, but it is not kind. It demands payment. It doesn't care if you are 70 years old. It doesn't care if you are a good person. It only cares about the bottom line. When Miller finally left, the house felt even emptier than before. I walked him to his car and stood in the driveway as he drove away. The gravel crunched under my feet, a sound that felt like everything was falling apart. I went back inside and found Linda still sitting at the table. She hadn't moved. I sat down next to her and took her hand. Her skin felt like cold marble. I'm sorry, Linda, I said. I'm so sorry. She didn't blame me, she never did. She just squeezed my hand and whispered, I know, Robert, I know. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked through the house in the dark, touching the walls, the banister, the photos on the mantel. I felt like a ghost in my own home. I was separated from the life I knew. I was separated from peace. I was separated from God by a mountain of spiritual and physical debt that I could never, ever bridge. I realized then that this is what the world feels like without a savior. It is a world of cold numbers and heartless laws. It is a world where you are only as good as your balance sheet. And my balance sheet was a tragedy. I was living under the shadow of a law that I had broken. Not by being a bad man, but by being a human man who thought he could save himself. I looked out at the dark Pennsylvania hills and felt a level of despair I had never known. The abyss was real, and I was falling into it. 3 days after the meeting with Mr. Miller, I reached the end of my rope. The notices had started coming in the mail daily. Red letters, urgent warnings, final demands. Every time the mail truck drove down our road, my stomach would knot up. I felt like a hunted man in my own backyard. It was a Thursday afternoon. The sky was a heavy, bruised purple, promising a storm that wouldn't break. I was sitting in my old leather armchair, the one with the worn-out spots on the armrests where I had rested my hands for 20 years. I wasn't reading. I wasn't watching television. I was just existing. The weight of the $215,000 was physically pressing down on my chest. I felt like I couldn't get a full breath of air. Then, there was a knock. It wasn't the sharp, professional knock of Mr. Miller. It wasn't the frantic, hurried knock of my daughter, Susan. It was a steady, patient, familiar sound. I didn't want to get up. I didn't want to see anyone. I didn't want to explain to another soul why we were losing everything. But the knock came again. Persistent. Calm. I stood up, my joints aching, and walked to the door. When I opened it, I froze. Standing there on my porch was an old friend, a man I hadn't seen in over 15 years. His name was Caleb. We had grown up together in the valley. We had played baseball together in the summers, worked in the same mills, and stood as best men at each other's weddings. But life had taken us in different directions. Caleb had moved away, built a successful business in another state, and we had lost touch, as people often do. Robert, he said. His voice was warm, like a fireplace on a cold night. He didn't wait for an invitation. He just looked at me with eyes that seemed to see right through the mask of I'm fine that I had been wearing. Caleb? I whispered. What are you doing here? I was passing through the area, he said, though I later realized that was a gentle lie. I had a feeling, a very strong feeling, that I needed to stop by and see my old friend. I stood back and let him in. He walked into the living room and sat down on the sofa. He didn't look at the foreclosure notices sitting on the coffee table. He didn't look at the empty, dusty corners of the house. He just looked at me. "You look tired." "Robert," he said softly. And that was it. The dam broke. I didn't mean for it to happen. But the shame, the fear, the $215,000, it all came pouring out. I told him everything. I told him about William's business, about the bank, about Linda's tears in the kitchen at 3 a.m. I told him how I felt like a failure, a man who couldn't protect his own home. I talked for what felt like hours. Caleb didn't interrupt. He didn't offer empty advice. He just listened. He sat there, in the fading light, a silent witness to my ruin. When I was finally finished, I felt exhausted. I looked at him, expecting him to say something about how I should have been more careful, or how I should try to negotiate with the bank. But Caleb didn't say any of those things. Instead, he did something I will never forget. He leaned forward and said, "Robert, this isn't an accident. Me being here, today, at this exact moment. It is an appointment." I didn't understand what he meant. An appointment? Caleb. I didn't schedule any meeting. I didn't even know you were in the state. "Not your appointment, Robert," he said with a small, knowing smile. "A divine appointment. You see, for the last few days, I couldn't get you off my mind. I was hundreds of miles away, and I felt a pull, a tug on my heart that I couldn't ignore. I knew you were in trouble. I didn't know what kind of trouble, but I knew I had to come." He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the same view I had been staring at for days. "You think this is a tragedy, don't you?" he asked, without turning around. "You think this is the end of your story? A sad, bitter ending for a hard-working man, isn't it?" I asked. "The numbers don't lie. Caleb, the law doesn't care about my feelings." He turned back to face me. "You're right. The law is perfect, and it is demanding. It requires justice. But you are forgetting the other half of the story. You are forgetting about love." He came back and sat down, leaning in close. "The cross. Robert. Think about the cross. To the people of that time, it was a tragedy. It was a mistake. It was a tool of death and shame. But it wasn't an accident. It was a divine appointment. It was the place where the perfect justice of God, which demands that every debt be paid, met the perfect love of God, which wants to save the debtor. I felt a strange warmth beginning to stir in my chest. For days, the cross had felt like a decoration, a symbol from a book. But the way Caleb spoke about it, it felt like a living thing. "Robert, the cross was the place where justice and love met. In a perfect kiss," Caleb said. I repeated those words in my head. A perfect kiss. It was a beautiful thought, but I was still looking at my foreclosure notice. "That sounds wonderful in a sermon, Caleb," I said, my voice bitter. "But I live in the real world. In the real world, someone has to pay. The bank doesn't accept kisses. They want $215,000. Caleb reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. His grip was firm. "You're right, Robert. Someone has to pay. That is the justice part, and that is why I am here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound checkbook. He laid it on the table, right on top of the pile of red ink notices. In that moment, the air in the room seemed to change. The shadows didn't seem as dark. The ticking of the clock didn't seem as loud. I looked at Caleb, then at the checkbook, then back at Caleb. I realized then what was happening. This wasn't just a friend visiting an old buddy. This was the intersection of my deepest need and a source of mercy I didn't even know existed. This was a divine appointment. I had been trying to bridge the abyss with my own hands, with my own sweat, and I had failed. I had been trying to earn a way out of a debt I could never pay, and while I was sitting in my armchair, drowning in my own helplessness, Mercy had driven hundreds of miles to knock on my door. Caleb. No, I said, my voice trembling. I can't ask you to do that. That is too much. That is impossible. You didn't ask. Robert, he said gently, I am offering, because I have been given much, and because you are my brother, and because, more than anything, I want you to see that the law is not the final word over your life. I started to cry then. Not the quiet, hidden tears Linda had shed in the kitchen. These were deep, racking sobs. The shame, the pride, the 40 years of thinking I was the one in control. It all came out. Caleb just sat there, his hand on my shoulder, as I wept. He didn't tell me to stop. He didn't tell me to be a man. He just stayed with me, in the middle of my brokenness. It was in that moment that I finally understood what the preacher meant all those years. The power of the cross is not just a story for the end of time. It is a reality for right now. It is the moment when you realize you cannot save yourself, and you finally stop trying. My living room, with its worn carpet and dusty shelves, had become holy ground. Justice was sitting at the table, acknowledging the debt, and love was sitting next to it, holding a pen. The divine appointment had begun. And my life, though I didn't know it yet, would never be the same. The morning of the final hearing felt like walking toward a gallows. I woke up at 4 a.m. The house was silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my suit hanging on the door. It was the same suit I wore to Susan's wedding. It was a suit for celebrations. But today, it felt like a burial shroud. We drove to the bank's regional headquarters in downtown Philadelphia. The building was a tower of glass and steel, cold and indifferent to the lives being broken inside its walls. Caleb was with us. He didn't say much, but his presence was like a lighthouse in a thick fog. He drove his own car, and when we met him in the lobby, he just gave me a firm nod. We were led into a conference room on the 12th floor. The table was made of polished mahogany, so shiny I could see my own tired face reflected in the wood. On one side of the table sat Mr. Miller, our lawyer, looking grim. Next to him was a representative from the bank, a man named Mr. Harrison. He had a face that looked like it was carved out of granite. He didn't look at us as people. He looked at us as a case number. I sat down in the chair, designated for the debtor. That word, debtor. It felt like a brand on my skin. I was the one who had signed the papers. I was the one who had failed. I felt the weight of the $215,000 pressing down on my shoulders, making it hard to even hold my head up. Mr. Harrison opened a thick blue folder. Robert, Linda, we are here to finalize the surrender of the property. The grace period has ended. The numbers are final. You have failed to meet the obligations of the loan, and the law is very clear on the consequences. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking. I wanted to speak, to apologize, to beg for more time, but the words wouldn't come. I was a guilty man in a courtroom, and the sentence was about to be passed. Then, something happened that I will tell my grandchildren about until the day I die. Caleb, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, stood up. The room went silent. Even Mr. Harrison looked up from his paperwork. Caleb didn't look at the banker. He looked at me. Robert, stand up, Caleb said softly. I didn't understand. Caleb, I have to be here. This is my mess. Stand up, he repeated. His voice a bit firmer this time. I stood up, my legs feeling like jelly. Caleb walked over to me. He took off his navy blue blazer and handed it to me. Then he did something incredible. He moved around the table and sat down in my chair. He sat in the seat of the debtor. He looked at Mr. Harrison and said, "From this moment on, you do not speak to Robert. You speak to me. His debt is now my debt. His failure is now my failure. I am standing in his place." I stood there, paralyzed. I was watching a living parable. I remembered the words from the old Bible in our living room. He who knew no sin became sin for us. I saw Caleb, a man who had done nothing wrong, a man who owed the bank nothing, sitting in the seat of judgment. He had stepped down from his position of safety and walked right into the middle of my disaster. He wasn't just helping me. He was becoming me in the eyes of the law. Mr. Harrison was confused. "Mr. Caleb, you realize what you are saying? If you take this position, you are legally responsible for the entire sum of $215,000. There is no turning back." Caleb didn't blink. He didn't hesitate. He just leaned forward and said, "I know exactly what I am doing. Proceed." As I watched them begin to move the paperwork toward Caleb, a wave of realization washed over me. This is what the cross was. It wasn't just Jesus dying for us, like a soldier dying for his country. It was Jesus dying as us. He took off his robe of glory, stepped down from the bench of the judge, and walked to the executioner's block in our place. On that cross, he took the brand of sinner and debtor, so that I could walk away with the brand of son. I realized that I was no longer alone in that room. I was no longer the one facing the law. The law was looking at Caleb now. The demands were being made of him. The pressure was on his shoulders. I felt a lightness in my chest that I haven't felt in years. It wasn't just that the money might be paid. It was the fact that someone loved me enough to take my place, to be humiliated in my stead, to be the debtor so I could be free. The meeting continued for a long time, but I wasn't listening to the legal jargon anymore. I was just looking at my friend. I was looking at the substitute. I saw the justice of the bank being satisfied, and the love of a friend being poured out. It was the most beautiful and the most terrifying thing I had ever seen, because I knew, deep down, that I didn't deserve it. I had done nothing to earn this, and that is exactly why it was so powerful. I walked out of that room a different man. My name was still Robert, but in the eyes of that bank, my debt had found a new home. It was no longer mine to carry. The substitute had arrived. The week following the meeting at the bank was a blur of paperwork and disbelief. Linda and I walked through our house like people in a dream. We touched the walls. We sat on the porch, and we whispered to each other, "Is this really happening?" We were waiting for the final word. We were waiting for the proof that the debt was truly gone. On Friday afternoon, Caleb came over to the house. He was carrying a single, white envelope. But this wasn't like the envelopes from the bank. This one didn't have urgent or final notice stamped on it in red. Susan and William were there too. They had been living under a cloud of guilt for months, blaming themselves for putting us in this position. We all gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Mr. Miller had laid out the abyss of our debt just a few weeks prior. Caleb sat down and opened the envelope. He pulled out a document from the bank. It was a formal release of lien and a certificate of satisfaction. At the bottom of the page, in the space where it listed the balance, was a series of zeros. $215,000, reduced to zero. But Caleb did something then that brought the whole room to tears. He pulled a thick, red felt-tip pen from his pocket. He laid the document flat on the table. "In the ancient world," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, "when a debt was paid, they didn't just file it away in a drawer. They would take the original document of the debt, the list of all the things the person owed, and they would nail it to a public post, or they would drive a nail right through the center of the paper." He looked at me, then at Linda and Susan. By driving a nail through the document, they were showing everyone that the debt no longer had any power. It was cancelled. It was finished. Caleb took that red pen and, with a firm hand, he drew a massive, dark, red X across the entire face of the legal document. The sound of the pen on the paper was loud in the quiet room. Squeak, squeak. Then, at the bottom, in big, bold letters, he wrote 3 words: paid in full. He didn't just say it, he marked it, he sealed it. When Jesus was on that cross, Caleb whispered, right before he breathed his last, he cried out one final word in the original language. It was tetelestai. It was a business term. It literally meant, the debt is paid in full. The receipt was nailed to the wood of the cross. I looked at that paper with the red X across it. I saw the $215,000, and I saw the red ink covering it. Suddenly, Susan burst into tears. She fell into her husband William's arms, sobbing with a sound of pure, unfiltered relief. It was the sound of a heavy chain finally snapping, the guilt that had been eating her alive, the fear that she had destroyed her parents' lives. It was all being washed away by that red ink. Linda reached out and touched the paper. She traced the red X with her finger, her eyes wet with tears. It's over. Robert, she whispered, we don't have to leave. We can stay. The "it is finished" of the cross isn't just a religious slogan. It is a legal declaration. It means the receipt has been issued. It means that when you look at your past, when you look at your failures, when you look at that mountain of spiritual debt you can never pay, you can see the red ink of the cross. I felt a weight leave my body that I didn't even know I was carrying. It was more than just the money. It was the spiritual debt. For years, I had felt like I owed God something. I felt like I had to be good enough to earn his love. I felt like I was always one mistake away from being foreclosed on by heaven. But looking at that red X, I realized that the receipt was already nailed to the wood. My spiritual debt wasn't just managed. It was cancelled. It was blotted out. Caleb handed the paper to me. Keep this, Robert. Every time you feel the fear coming back, every time the enemy tries to tell you that you aren't enough, look at this red ink. It is finished. We sat there for a long time, just holding each other. There was no more silence in the house. There was the sound of Susan's laughter, the sound of Linda humming a hymn in the kitchen as she started to make dinner, and the sound of my own heart beating with a new kind of rhythm, the rhythm of freedom. We had been living under the shadow of a law that demanded our lives, but we were now living in the light of a mercy that had given us everything. The instrument of our shame, the debt that was meant to destroy us, had become the very thing that showed us the depth of our friend's love. I realized then that the power of the cross is not in the wood itself. It is a fact that the work is truly, finally, completely finished. There is nothing left for me to pay. There is nothing left for me to earn. I am not a debtor anymore. I am a son, and I am home. The silence was the first thing I noticed. For months, our home had been under a kind of psychological siege. It is a strange thing to be afraid of your own telephone, but that was our reality. Every time that phone rang, my heart would jump into my throat. I knew it would be them. The collection agencies. Men with cold, rehearsed voices from companies with names like Apex Recovery or National Credit Solutions. They didn't just want the $215,000. They wanted my dignity. They would call at 8 in the morning, and again at 7 in the evening. They would ask questions that made me feel like a criminal. They would imply that I was a dishonest man, a man who didn't take care of his family. They were the accusers, and they had the legal right to harass me because I was in debt. Even in our small town, the whispers had started. I would see neighbors turn their heads when I walked into the local hardware store. I would hear the hushed conversations stop when Linda walked into the church foyer. People knew. The shame was a shadow that followed us everywhere. But then, the payment was made. Caleb didn't just send a check. He sent a message. A few days after the red ink was placed on our debt, the phone rang. Out of habit. I felt that old familiar knot of fear in my stomach. I picked it up, ready to be humiliated once again. "Is this Robert?" a voice asked. It was the same man from the agency who had been calling me for weeks. "Yes, this is Robert," I said, my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end. I heard the sound of typing. Then, the man's voice changed. It wasn't aggressive anymore. It sounded confused, even a bit deflated. "Mr. Robert, I am calling to... Well, I am looking at your file. It appears there has been a satisfaction of the claim. The account is closed. Our legal right to pursue this matter has been terminated." I sat down in my chair. "Does that mean you won't be calling anymore?" "We are legally barred from contacting you again regarding this matter," he said. "The debt is gone. You are. You are no longer in our system." When I hung up that phone, I realized what had happened. Caleb had used the law to destroy the power of the law. I thought about what I had learned in church all those years. The Bible says that on the cross, Jesus spoiled principalities and powers and made a public show of them. He triumphed over them. I finally understood what that meant in a real, practical way. The enemy, the one who wants to accuse us, thinks that the debt is his greatest weapon. He thinks that, as long as we owe something, he has a legal right to sit on our shoulder and whisper that we are failures. He thinks the cross was his victory because he thought he had finally destroyed the Son of God. But the cross was actually a trap. It was a divine sting operation. The enemy thought he was winning, but by nailing Jesus to that wood, he was actually sealing his own defeat. Because when Jesus paid the debt for every man and woman, he stripped the enemy of his legal right to accuse us. I imagine the dark forces of this world looking at the record of our sins, the mountain of spiritual debt we have accumulated, and realizing that the file is empty. They look for the $215,000 of our failures, and all they see is a red mark that says, "Paid in full." They are disarmed. Their weapons are broken. Their phone calls have to stop. In our town, the whispers changed too. Caleb had made sure the bank filed the satisfaction of the mortgage at the county courthouse. It was public record. The neighbors who had been whispering about our fall from grace now saw a miracle of restoration. But it wasn't just about the neighbors. It was about my own mind. I realized that every time I felt that old sense of shame creeping back in, I could look at the empty phone. I could look at the quiet mailbox. The accuser had no more ground to stand on. He had been kicked out of the courtroom. If you are listening to this, and you feel like you are constantly being reminded of your past mistakes, I want you to know something. If you have accepted the work of the substitute, the enemy has no legal right to talk to you. He is a trespasser. He is a liar who is trying to collect on a debt that no longer exists. Caleb's payment was so thorough that it didn't just pay the bank. It silenced the critics. It didn't just save our house. It restored our name. The power of the cross is the power to strip your past of its ability to hurt you. It is the power to stand in front of your accusers and say, "You have no claim here. The file is closed. The debt is satisfied." I walked out onto my porch that evening and breathed in the fresh Pennsylvania air. For the first time in a year, the air didn't feel heavy. The world felt open. The enemy had lost his grip, and I was finally, truly, free from his voice. You would think that after the debt was paid, after the phone stopped ringing, and after the red ink was dry, that life would be perfect. You would think that I would wake up every morning with a song in my heart, but the human heart is a complicated thing, especially at 70 years old. About a month after Caleb had saved us, I found myself slipping into a dark place. It started small. I would look at the house, our beautiful, saved home, and instead of feeling joy, I would feel a pang of unworthiness. I started thinking, who am I to receive such a gift? I am the one who made the mistake. I am the irresponsible one. Caleb worked hard for his money, and I just took it. The pride of a hard-working American man is a double-edged sword. We are taught to earn our way. We are taught that there is no such thing as a free lunch. So, when someone gives you a gift of $215,000, it can actually feel like a burden. I started trying to pay him back in my own way. I would go over to Caleb's house and offer to mow his lawn. I would try to fix his fence. I even tried to send him small checks of $50 from my Social Security. I was trying to earn the gift. I was trying to prove that I was good enough to be saved. One night, Linda found me sitting at the kitchen table with my old ledger book. I was trying to calculate how many years I would have to work a part-time job at the hardware store to pay Caleb back at least half of what he gave us. My math was discouraging. At my age, it would take me over 100 years. Linda sat down across from me. She didn't say anything for a long time. She just watched me struggle with the numbers. Finally, she reached out and closed the ledger book. "Robert," she said, her voice as gentle as a summer breeze. "What are you doing?" "I have to pay him back." "Linda," I said, not looking up. "I can't just let him carry this. It isn't right. I feel like I am still under a cloud. I feel like I am still a debtor." Linda leaned in closer. "Robert, look at me." I looked up. Her eyes were full of a kind of wisdom that only comes through years of faith and trials. "Robert, when Caleb wrote that check, did he ask for a payment plan?" "No," I whispered. "When he drew that red X through the debt, did he say, 'Only if you work for me for the rest of your life'?" "No," I said again. "Then why are you trying to put yourself back in a cage?" she asked. "If the person who paid the debt says it is enough, why do you say it is not?" That question hit me like a physical blow. If the one who paid the price is satisfied, who am I to say that his sacrifice wasn't enough? Linda took my hand. "You are living under the shadow of condemnation. Robert, you are punishing yourself for a sin that has already been forgiven. You are trying to buy something that has already been given to you as a gift." She was right. I was doing exactly what so many of us do with the cross of Jesus. We say we believe in it. We say we are thankful for it. But then, we spend our lives trying to be good enough to deserve it. We live in a constant state of guilt. We tell ourselves that we are unworthy. We keep a mental ledger of all our failures, and we try to balance it out with our good works. But the cross says that the balance is already zero. "Robert," Linda continued, "if you keep trying to pay him back, you are actually insulting his gift. You are saying that his love wasn't quite enough, and that he needs your $50 checks to finish the job. You aren't being humble. You are being proud." I had never thought of it that way. My guilt was actually a form of pride. I wanted to be my own savior. I didn't want to be a charity case. But before God, we are all charity cases. I realized that the power of the cross is not just in the finished work on the wood, but in the finished work in our hearts. It is the ability to receive, to truly, deeply receive a gift we did not earn. If the cross was enough for God, it should be enough for me. God is not looking at my ledger. He is not looking at the $215,000 of my past mistakes. He is looking at the sacrifice of his son. He is looking at the red ink. I looked at Linda, and then I looked at the closed ledger book. I realized that my self-punishment wasn't making me a better person. It was just making me a miserable one. It was keeping me from enjoying the life that Caleb had sacrificed to give back to me. The cross is the final word on your worth. "Robert," Linda said, "it says that you were worth dying for, not because you are perfect, but because you are loved." I stood up and walked over to the trash can. I dropped the ledger book inside. It made a dull thud. I decided, right then and there, to stop trying to earn my way out of a debt that was already gone. I decided to stop living under the shadow of condemnation. The power of the cross is the power to look at your past and say, yes, I failed. Yes, I was in debt. But it is finished, and I am loved. I went to bed that night, and, for the first time in a month, I didn't dream of numbers. I didn't dream of work. I dreamed of a bridge, a beautiful, solid bridge that had been built over an abyss I could never cross. And I realized that the best way to thank the bridge builder was simply to walk across it and enjoy the view on the other side. If you are struggling today with feelings of unworthiness, if you are trying to pay God back for your mistakes, I want you to listen to Linda's words. If he thinks it is enough, why don't you? Stop the self-punishment. Stop the guilt. Look at the cross and just say, thank you. It is spring now in the valley. The grey, stubborn winter of Pennsylvania has finally surrendered to the green of the rolling hills. I am sitting on my porch, watching the robins pull worms from the damp earth. There is a smell of wet grass and lilac in the air. It is the smell of a new beginning. I have that old, red-marked document in a frame now. It sits on my desk, not as a reminder of my failure, but as a trophy of a great victory. But lately, I have realized something even deeper. I have realized that the power of my freedom did not come from that piece of paper. It did not even come from the ink that Caleb used to mark the debt away. The power was in the man. The power was in the heart of my friend, and the sacrifice he was willing to make. For a long time, I thought the most important part of the story was the cross. I thought it was all about the suffering, the payment, and the heavy price. And don't get me wrong, that price was everything. But as I sit here today, I realize that if the story ended with the payment, it would only be half a story. Think about it. If Caleb had paid my debt, but then disappeared, or if he had died right after writing the check, I would still be a man sitting in a house with a paid bill. But I would be alone. I would be living in a museum of a past miracle. But Caleb did not just pay the debt. He stayed. He walked with me. He became a constant presence of life and joy in our family. It is the same with the cross. Many people look at the cross as a piece of jewelry or a decoration on top of a steeple. They see it as a symbol of death. But the power of the cross is not in the wood. It is in the one who hung upon it, and it is in the empty tomb that followed. The cross was the place where my old life, with all its debts, all its pride, and all its failures, went to die. It had to die. Because you cannot put new wine into old, cracked wineskins. I had to reach the end of my own strength, so that a new kind of strength could begin. I remember a conversation I had with my grandson, Tommy, just last week. He was looking at the framed document on my desk. He asked me, "Grandpa, why are you so happy all the time now? You used to be so grumpy." I laughed, and I pulled him close. I told him, "Tommy, it is because I am a man who died and came back to life." He looked at me with those big, confused eyes. So I explained it to him, in a way a child or an old man can understand. I told him that the debt was like a heavy stone that was tied around my neck. It was pulling me down into the dark water. I couldn't swim. I couldn't save myself. But then, a friend came and took that stone. He let it pull him down instead. And for a moment, it looked like the water had won. It looked like the end. But the water could not hold him. He rose. And when he rose, he reached out his hand and pulled me up with him. The empty tomb is the final proof that the payment on the cross was accepted. It is the receipt that God has signed with the breath of life. If Jesus had stayed in that grave, then the cross would just be another tragic story of a good man who failed. But because the tomb is empty, we know that death has been defeated. The preacher says it this way, and I finally understand it now. It was the place where death died so that life could begin. I am 70 years old, but I feel like I am just beginning to live. For 40 years, I lived to earn. I lived to build. I lived to protect my own little kingdom. I was always working to stay ahead of the debt, always working to be good enough. Now, I live to say thank you. There is a massive difference between those two things. When you live to pay a debt, you are a slave. Your eyes are always on the floor, looking at the numbers. But when you live because someone else has already paid your debt, you are a son. Your eyes are on the horizon. You are free to love, free to give, and free to fail, without the fear of being destroyed. I don't work at the hardware store anymore because I have to. I go there because I love the people. I want to tell them that there is hope. I want to tell them that they don't have to carry their burdens alone. Linda and I spend our evenings now just talking. Not about bills. Not about the bank. We talk about the future. We talk about the legacy we are leaving for Susan, William, and the grandkids. We are teaching them that their worth is not found in their bank account, but in the sacrifice that was made for them long ago. I realize that the greatest way I can honor Caleb, and the greatest way I can honor the cross, is to be happy, to be truly, deeply, unshakably free. If you are listening to this, and you are still carrying the weight of your past, I want you to look at the empty tomb. Don't just look at the suffering. Look at the victory. The stone has been rolled away. The debt has been cancelled. The prison doors are wide open. You don't have to save yourself. You don't have to earn what has already been given. Just look to the cross. See the finished work. And then look to the garden and see the new life. It is the only way to the Father. It is the only foundation for a life of true freedom. I am Robert, and I am a free man. Not because I am perfect, but because I am loved by a God who was willing to become my substitute. My house is still the same old house. The floors still creak. The roof will probably need shingles in another few years. But everything is different, because the man living inside this house is new. Death died in my living room that day when Caleb sat down at my table. And life, real life, began. I hope you find that same life today. It is waiting for you at the foot of the cross and at the entrance of an empty tomb. As the sun finally disappears behind the hills here in Pennsylvania and the fireflies begin to dance in the yard, I want to thank you for sitting here on the porch with me. I know your time is precious. We have reached an age where we understand that every hour is a gift. And I am honored that you chose to spend this time listening to my story. I do not know what kind of envelope is waiting in your mailbox today. It might not be a debt of $215,000 like mine was. Perhaps your burden is different. Maybe it is the weight of a secret regret from 40 years ago. Maybe it is the heavy silence of a house that feels too empty. Or the fear of a medical report that you haven't shared with anyone yet. Whatever your mountain is, I want you to remember what we talked about today. The power of the cross is not just an old story for a Sunday morning. It is the final word on your value and your future. It says that you were worth dying for. It says that your past is gone and your debt is cancelled. Please, my friend, do not spend another night trying to pay for sins that have already been erased. God is not looking at your failures. He is not counting your mistakes on his fingers. He is looking at the sacrifice of his Son. If the cross was enough for him, it is more than enough for you. Do not try to save yourself. And do not try to earn what has already been given. Just look to that empty tomb and receive the finished work. It is the only way to find real peace. And it is the only foundation for a life of true freedom. If this story touched your heart, or if it reminded you that you are deeply loved and completely forgiven, please consider subscribing to our channel. It helps us reach more people who are sitting in the dark, waiting for a message of hope. And if you know someone, maybe a friend from church, or a brother who is struggling, please share this video with them today. You never know who might be standing on the edge of their own abyss, praying for a bridge to appear. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me your story. Tell me where you are finding your strength today. We are all in this journey together, and we are never truly alone. Until next time, keep your eyes on the cross and your heart in His peace. God bless you, and God bless your family. We will see you in the next one.